Hello, I'm Blanks Potato, and I'm here to teach my drawing style, drawing process, painting process, whatever you call it. This is all impromptu. I don't have anything scripted. Anyways, I wanted to teach people, especially because I have this art college thing, and I'd rather give the information out for young artists out there than have them go through this. Anyways, um, digital painting as first thing before we get started. Digital painting is very different in how you have to see it compared to conventional digital illustration. Let's say in illustration, you mostly think about the line art, lines, and then you go from there to cell shading or whatever, right? In digital illustration, in digital painting, it's more focused on shapes, shade, color theory, like actual painting. And so, instead of seeing your object with its lines and its lines, you see its edges and its soft edges as shapes, and you start thinking of it like that. And so, you'll understand with how I'm gonna structure this tutorial. And so, an example of what I mean by that. Here's a really badly drawn cube, and you can already see the what I'm talking about. Right? I sketch this cube, and then I shape it off into its different shades. Here you have the darker shade, and then you have a mid-tone, and then you have a highlight, right? You can see that the focus is less on the lines and more on the shape here. You see like the dark square, and then another square, and then a triangle. You can see how I'm focusing here on the shape of each side instead of the square as a whole when I colored it. It's all one thing, and all of it is that you're using these different shapes to imply dimension. Now, before we get started on the whole thing, you need to learn the basics of lighting. So here I'm making an orb. This is the first thing you learn in art college is shading. You see how there's a direction where the light is coming from. There's the mid-tone, and then there's the shadow. And so you break down light here through these different parts. You have the highlight, then you have the reflected light, and then the core shadow, and then the mid-tone. The mid-tone is your base color, as here you see me shading it. And then you have the highlights where the light is coming from. The core shadow is the main shadow. This is the darkest part of your painting or your object. Most of the time, this will be, of course, where light doesn't bounce off. And then you have behind it, right? You have reflected light. Reflected light is the light that, by its name, reflects off of the object or the ground. And this implies atmosphere, volume, but also it breaks off the core shadow, because you have a core shadow and you're gonna have a cast shadow. Cast shadow is what the object cast, the shape of it, the silhouette of it, the shadow you see when you're walking around and there's a light above you. I don't have it in here in this artwork. You saw me do it earlier. I erased it. I don't know why. But most of the time, your reflected light is faint. At times, it's either depends on how intense your light is, but at times it's very faint, almost the same color as your base color, your midtone. Your midtone, again, is the base color of your object, the main color, the main light, and then your highlight is where the light bounces. And a lot of the time, when it curves or when it bends, it follows the contour in a way that's oppositely shaped to um, your shadow. And with your highlight's color and intensity, it depends on how close the light is. Sometimes the light would be super close, you'd have a super saturated light, or sometimes it'd be very far, and at the times it'll be atmospheric lighting and it'll be subtle. Same thing with your shadow. The darker the area is, the more intense the black or the whatever shaded color it is, and the more subtle your lighting is, more subtle the shadows are, the more lit up the place is, the less likely there is to be shadows. But there's times when there's a bright light and there will be intense shadows, and that's what I do with my art, my recent art actually. And at that time, both will be as intense as each other, and they will have atmospheric light, atmospheric reflection, shadows, blah blah blah. And I'll explain that later. But first, let's go to the more important aspect of this specific medium, special painting, and that is contours. I'm gonna give a crash course to this, but contours is how your object bends. It's the edges of your object, and here I'm making grids to show you the contours of the object, how light bends around it. And this is basically one of the other first things you learn in art college, is that they're gonna make you do contours. They're gonna get you an object, you're gonna simplify it to its basic shapes, and then you start adding these grids to visualize the 3D object in front of you. And that's what's important with painting and lighting, is that these 3D objects, they are how we convey their physical presence through light. And here I'm gonna break down some of my artworks, and you can see I'm color picking them to show you the intensity and how color itself, color theory, can imply the atmosphere and the color, the atmosphere and the lighting of your piece, with me using darker, more muted colors here. And you can see the more saturated, brighter colors for the light, and for the main body to have this darker, more subdued palette. And you can see areas that have highlights on them, they have more intense color, they're more saturated. Here you can see I'm putting arrows on them, and the area next to those, the highlights, is you have the reflected light, atmospheric light, and you can see how their colors are more faded, blends in more, and then the light source of the suit, the lines. See, it has yellow compared to red, and then color theory that just implies the intensity of the light, and that's how you get that that feeling that it's glowing. And you can see the black background, right? In contrast to these high saturated colors, that's the core shadow. And you can see the contour and how these lights bend around the human figure to imply that the body there is 3D. You see the light bend around his muscle, his chest, his suit, and then in his shoes. They're the way I'm blending them too. It's very, um, you know. Sometimes I don't render them as much, and that gives you all the detail you need. And here you have another one. You have the light source, and you can see how the light source gives the atmospheric light on the character and how it bends down on her hair, on her clothes, on her pants, and how each of these lights, they bend in different ways to accommodate the contour. And then in the secondary light, it gives more highlight on not just the character but also on the bike, and how the bike itself has some lighting from this first light source and some from the secondary. And you can see me using different faces here, how each contour, each area has its own different values and different lightings. Here, to visualize that, you see the blue is your darker color, your lighter color is the pink, and then the purple is the in-between, right? That's the first phase, the first angle. You have the second and third. See, some objects have different values, different way light bounces off of them. And so when you turn this black and white, you add the highlights and stuff, you can see how in each area in which light is bouncing off of, one area will be darker than the other. And you use harder edges and softer edges to imply that. And that's how I do armor. Some parts that are lit up, they'd have higher values, and other parts won't. And sometimes I would combine a mid value, a lighter value, and a dark value together to imply an angle. And that's because light bounces off things in different ways. And so here you can see how your colors, see how this black area, right? Using a brighter color, very saturated, can give you intense lighting in of itself without rendering as much. You already have the ideas you need, right, to see how dark that is. Now, going back to that Commoner Zest artwork, you can see I have uses of different edges. Edges are important when you're painting because you have to utilize them in a way that because it implies the shape and how light bounces off, right? You have to use it properly. Not everything has to have a hard edge, but also not everything has to have a soft edge. If you want more realistic painting styles, like how those hyper realistic anime character paintings, they have softer edges. They use softer edges, and you can see these softer edges, the ones that have gradients on them, like in the abs and then in the chest. You can see the red gradienting out to the greenish gray, and then some have hard edges. That implies the shape of it, how more intense the shadow are, but also it gives you a definite example of what the physical shape of the object is. And so a lot of this object here, it's all hard edges that are black, and then within those black you have those shaded areas that have more softer edges. You see how light bends and curves through them. And so if you look at like older classical paintings, they would combine these two, and a lot of the time they use hard edges for implied detail, for things that they don't want to render out, but also because there's a thing called the hierarchy of details. And I think I do that a lot. Um, some areas like this, the shoes, right? You can see it's all hard edges. Some areas are softer edges, but it's all hard edges, and I barely rendered it. You can see it's still sketchy, it's all messy, but all it needs is the lights, the highlight, the mid tone, and then the dark colors, and then also the atmospheric light. There's a subtle red gradient there, and that's all you need. You don't have to hyper detailize every piece of your artwork, because a lot of the time those details disappear, and those details that disappear is just more time you use up that you could use on other places. And so a hierarchy of these details, you have to choose which area you want to render more and which areas you want to render less, but still have that detail. And that's why I use a combination of hard and soft edges and good and proper lighting and use of color theory and contours to imply these details without having to meticulously make them, right? And another example of that is in this other artwork. You see some areas, they have more rendered areas. You have more shading, more softer curves, specifically the face. You see that the face here is the main focal point. And then in the background, you have this blurry dots of color that I barely rendered. And all I did was I added colors, touches, dots, and in turn, I have the lighting in mind to give you a sense of that there's something there, but the detail is so inconsequential that you don't really need to focus on it. But they're there, that they're 3D, and it gives more gives you more feel. And so now, zooming out, you can see that there's more rendering on the motorcycle and on the main person, the main subject. And in the background, all you see are strokes, are little blocks of light, of color, and that gives you all the detail you need, all the texture, and the hard edges, like here in the wall corner here. You see how that's a hard edged area, and then everything else is soft edge, right? And then in the background, you have these flowers that are just dots, but they give you an idea that there's a blurry, there's something there, that it's tangible, right? And that's part of why, what you should focus on in your painting is that you should know when to add detail, when to fully render something out, and when not to. You focus on that. You focus on the main area where you want the eyes of the viewers to be, and then everything else is small details that you can just combine these techniques of hard and soft edges of these lights together. And that's what makes knowing hard and soft edges important, because you can do really crazy magic with them. There's like a lot of artists. There's this artist called Wall Up. I forgot, but they were a god, and they have these hyper realistic paintings, but when you zoom in, they're not really fully rendered, right? They're just blocks of color, and then there's areas that have the rendering, that have the focus, that needs the focus and the care that is needed to make them actually look realistic, and then everything else is not that fully rendered. And that's a technique that a lot of artists that I've seen that are younger or haven't painted much or drawn much fixate on, is that they put too much time on areas that you could essentially use these techniques on, and it will streamline it and it will make your whole composition better because there's less detail on areas that you don't focus on and more detail on what you should focus on, making your viewers eyes point into where they're supposed to look at. And here we're gonna start implementing this techniques I mentioned with this doodle. I don't really have an idea what I wanted with this, but you know, I was experimenting, and here I'll show you how I experiment with my art, how I use my lighting and the techniques I've told you. You can see how I'm using the highlights or reflected light on areas that are lit up by the eyes and by that scarf, that glowing scarf. I'm using a textured brush. By the way, use textured brushes. They really give more oomph to your art and lets you experiment more with what you can do. And I'm using color correction or color balancing to change the palette to see what works. And here I'm just micro editing stuff using layers like overlay to intensify the lighting on some areas. And here's the final work. It's done, and you can see I implemented all I taught you guys with the lighting and how with atmospheric light, with edges, and how you can use those atmospheric light, those edges, to imply the shape of your artwork. See that? Especially in the mask there. And yeah, hope you guys learned something. Hope this was helpful or was coherent or whatever. This is all impromptu. Yeah, and I don't I don't really know. I don't really know. But yeah, thanks for watching. Bye. Something.